So that was General Mark Milley's extraordinarily pointed and specific farewell speech in Arlington, Virginia today. Specifically, this is someone who chooses his words carefully, who understands the moment in which we live better than perhaps anyone alive right now. And Chairman Milley used this moment to warn against, quote, wannabe dictators. He placed an emphasis on protecting all of us against enemies, foreign and domestic. Chairman Milley's tenure as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and more than 40 years in the military ends in the same week that he's responding to a social media death threat made by the unstable, disgraced ex-president under whom he served as top military advisor. Milley swore in his successor today, General Charles Q. Brown Jr., after an 11th hour Senate vote last week to confirm him, with no thanks to the MAGA Republicans.
Hi, everyone. Adam is here. So what just happened? The sitting president of the United States publicly accused his own chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officer in the country, of treason. Not a policy disagreement, not a critique of poor judgment. Treason, the specific crime defined in the Constitution as levying war against the United States or giving aid and comfort to its enemies.
The president suggested last Friday that the nation's highest-ranking military officer deserves to be executed for communications the general had with China during the final months of the Trump administration.
And then, because that wasn't extreme enough, the president added that in earlier times, the punishment for what this general had done would have been death. The President of the United States suggested his own top general deserved to be executed, and the general, Mark Milley, the man Trump himself appointed to the nation's highest military position, responded in a way that will be studied by historians and constitutional scholars for generations.
President Trump recently said that your dealings with China were so egregious that in times gone by, the punishment would have been death.
That's right, he said that. That's correct.
He is suggesting that you be punished by death. The former commander-in-chief to his former top military advisor.
Look, I'm a soldier. I've been faithful and loyal to the Constitution of the United States for 44 and a half years. And my family and I have sacrificed greatly for this country, my mother and father before them. And, you know, as much as these comments are directed at me, it's also directed at the institution of the military. And there's 2.1 million of us in uniform. And the American people can take it to the bank that all of us, every single one of us, from private to general, we're loyal to that Constitution and we'll never turn our back on it no matter what the threats.
He said that United States troops swear an oath not to a wannabe dictator, but to the Constitution. Wannabe dictator. The former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, speaking from first-hand experience at the highest levels of the Trump administration, used that specific phrase in a public statement directed at the man who had just accused him of a capital crime.
Is that document that all of us in uniform swear to protect and defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. We don't take an oath to a tribe. We don't take an oath to a religion. We don't take an oath to a king or a queen, or to a tyrant, or a dictator. And we don't take an oath to a wannabe dictator. We don't take an oath to an individual.
That is not a dramatization. That is the documented reality of what happened between Donald Trump and the military institution he commands. And it tells you more about the state of American civil-military relations than any analysis ever could. Let me take you inside what actually triggered this confrontation, because the context matters as much as the conflict itself. Near the end of Trump's first term, in the chaotic period surrounding the 2020 election and January 6th, General Milley made back-channel calls to his Chinese military counterpart. His purpose was to reassure the Chinese that the United States was not planning a surprise military strike, and that if any military action was being considered, they would be warned in advance. These calls, documented by Bob Woodward and Robert Costa in their book Peril, were made because Milley was genuinely concerned that Trump's erratic behavior in the post-election period, combined with Chinese intelligence assessments that Trump might launch a military strike to distract from his domestic political situation, created a real risk of catastrophic miscalculation between two nuclear-armed powers. Milley's defenders argue these calls were a responsible exercise of military judgment in an unprecedented situation. A top general using established military-to-military communication channels to prevent a dangerous miscalculation that could have led to nuclear conflict. Trump's characterization was different. He called it treason. He viewed those calls not as responsible crisis management, but as a betrayal of presidential authority. A general going around the commander-in-chief to communicate directly with a foreign military without authorization. Both perspectives reflect genuine and serious views on a genuinely complicated civil-military situation, and the conflict between them goes to the heart of what the relationship between civilian leadership and military command is supposed to look like in a constitutional democracy. Now let me explain why this conflict is so much more significant than a personal feud between two powerful men. The American constitutional framework for civil-military relations rests on the principle of civilian control of the military. The president, as commander-in-chief, directs military operations, and the military follows lawful orders from civilian leadership. That framework is essential because a military that acts independently of civilian direction is a threat to democratic accountability, and because the concentration of lethal force in military institutions requires that they be subordinate to democratic political authority. But the framework has always contained an implicit exception. Military officers have professional and constitutional obligations that don't disappear simply because a commander-in-chief gives a contrary order. Officers swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution, not to the president personally. That oath creates a zone of professional and constitutional obligation that military officers are expected to maintain even when civilian direction conflicts with it. The tension between those two principles, civilian control and constitutional oath, is the specific tension that the Trump-Milley confrontation made explicit and public in a way it has rarely been made in American history. Let's dig into the treason accusation because the language Trump used deserves careful analysis. Calling a military officer a traitor is not routine political criticism. Traitor is a specific constitutional crime defined in Article 3 of the Constitution. Accusing a named individual of treason is an accusation of the most serious offense in the American legal code. When Trump made that accusation publicly in posts directed at his tens of millions of followers, he wasn't just expressing personal frustration. He was making a specific and serious accusation that, if believed by a significant portion of his audience, could generate the kind of threat environment we've documented in the context of Trump's attacks on judges. The documented surge in threats against federal judges following Trump's public attacks on them is directly relevant to understanding what happens when Trump publicly accuses a named individual of treason and suggests their punishment should be death. He is not just criticizing Milley's professional judgment, he is potentially inciting his followers against a specific named individual, a retired four-star general, with the most extreme possible characterization of that individual's conduct. And the death penalty addition, in earlier times the punishment would have been death, is a specific escalation that makes the accusation not just an aggressive political attack, but a statement that could reasonably be interpreted as encouraging violence against a specific named person. Now let's talk about Milley's response, because the wannabe dictator speech is the centerpiece of this entire confrontation. The statement that U.S. troops swear an oath not to a wannabe dictator but to the Constitution was made in a public setting, widely reported, and immediately understood by everyone who heard it as a direct and deliberate response to Trump's conduct and Trump's accusations. The specific phrase, wannabe dictator, is the most remarkable element because it is not the language of a military officer making a careful diplomatic statement about abstract civil-military principles. It is the language of a senior military leader making a specific and pointed characterization of a specific political figure. The former president who had just suggested he deserved the death penalty, in terms that explicitly compare that figure's conduct to that of a dictator rather than a legitimate democratic leader. Milley was not saying Trump was imperfect. He was not saying Trump's policies were wrong. He was not saying Trump's leadership style was difficult. He was saying that Trump's relationship to constitutional authority, his attempt to use the military as a personal political instrument, his claims of loyalty to himself rather than to the Constitution, reflected the behavior of a wannabe dictator. That characterization from the man who served as Trump's own top military advisor, from someone who saw the inside of the Trump White House, from the most senior military position available, carries a weight that no political opponent's criticism can match. And the constitutional framing matters. The oath to the Constitution rather than to a wannabe dictator is the specific reminder that military officers' professional obligations do not end where presidential preferences begin. That the institution Milley served is constitutionally obligated to the document rather than to the person who happens to temporarily hold the commander-in-chief title. Now let's place this confrontation in the broader context of civil-military tensions that have developed across Trump's terms, because understanding the pattern makes the Milley moment even more significant. Trump has repeatedly floated using the military for domestic political purposes in ways that senior military leaders have consistently resisted. During the 2020 racial justice protests, Trump pushed for active-duty military to be deployed against American civilian protesters under the Insurrection Act. Defense Secretary Mark Esper publicly opposed it and was fired. Trump reportedly expressed interest in using the military to seize voting machines after the 2020 election, a proposal that military and legal advisors told him was illegal and that they refused to support. Across his second term, the deployment of National Guard troops in ways that federal judges have found to violate court orders, the expansion of military involvement in immigration enforcement, and the broader pattern of using military and law enforcement institutions as instruments of domestic political control have continued to generate resistance from officers who view those deployments as inconsistent with the constitutional role of the military. The pattern of resistance, from Milley's public wannabe dictator statement to Esper's opposition to Insurrection Act deployment to the broader resistance among senior officers to using military force against American civilians, describes a military institution that is maintaining its constitutional orientation even under significant political pressure to subordinate that orientation to presidential preferences. And the Trump-Milley confrontation, in which the president called his own general a traitor for maintaining that orientation, is the most visible and most documented instance of the specific conflict between presidential demands for personal loyalty and the military's constitutional obligation to the document rather than the person. The domestic deployment dimension of these tensions connects directly to war powers and constitutional questions. When a president uses military force or threatens to use it without congressional authorization, the military officers who are ordered to carry out those operations face their own version of the same tension that Milley faced. They are being directed by the commander-in-chief to take actions that may not have the congressional authorization that the Constitution requires. Their oath to the Constitution creates a professional and ethical obligation to raise those concerns, even when doing so generates the kind of personal attacks that Milley received. The documented pattern of senior military officers pushing back against the most legally questionable uses of military power, opposing Insurrection Act deployment, raising war powers' concerns about unauthorized military operations, resisting the use of military institutions for domestic political purposes, is the institutional expression of the same principle that Milley articulated. The oath is to the Constitution, not to the president, not to any political agenda. And the military institution is maintaining that orientation even when it generates accusations of treason from the person it is constitutionally subordinate to. Let me give you 4 clear points to take away from this. Trump's treason accusation and death penalty suggestion against Milley is the most extreme presidential attack on a senior military officer in modern American history. Its significance goes beyond the personal conflict to reveal a fundamental claim about the nature of military loyalty that is incompatible with the constitutional framework of civil-military relations. The treason accusation rests on the premise that Milley's back-channel calls constituted a betrayal of his obligation. But that premise assumes that military officers' obligations run to the president personally rather than to the constitutional framework that both the president and the military are supposed to serve. Milley's defenders argued that his obligations ran to preventing a catastrophic military miscalculation that could have produced nuclear conflict, a responsibility grounded in his oath to defend the Constitution and the country rather than in personal loyalty to a specific president. The conflict between those two understandings of military loyalty is the specific conflict the treason accusation makes explicit. Milley's wannabe dictator response is the most significant public statement about civil-military relations made by an American military officer in the modern era. It explicitly characterizes a specific president's conduct as inconsistent with democratic constitutional governance, and does so in the most direct and publicly visible terms available, establishing a permanent record of how the nation's highest-ranking military officer assessed the relationship between the Trump administration and the constitutional framework the military is sworn to defend. The language choice, deliberately provocative, specifically constitutional in its framing, represents a decision by Milley to use his institutional credibility and his public platform to make the most direct possible statement about what he observed from the inside. The broader pattern of civil-military tensions, the Insurrection Act opposition, the voting machine seizure resistance, the war powers concerns, the second-term deployment controversies, describes a military institution that is maintaining its constitutional orientation under sustained political pressure. This maintenance of institutional integrity is one of the most important safeguards of democratic governance operating in the current political environment. We've documented across multiple stories the pattern of judicial resistance, courts refusing to be the blank check protection Trump thought he had. The civil-military resistance we're describing here is the military institution's equivalent of that judicial resistance. Both forms of institutional resistance, judicial and military, are operating simultaneously, and their convergence describes a constitutional system where the institutional safeguards are holding even under the most sustained pressure they have faced in the modern era. Here's what we need to watch as these tensions continue. The ongoing legal challenges to military deployments, the court orders that have found specific deployments to violate federal law, and the administration's compliance or defiance with those orders will continue generating data points about the relationship between military command and judicial authority. The war powers question, specifically whether military officers are raising internal concerns about conducting operations without congressional authorization, is one of the most important pending civil-military questions. The personnel decisions, who gets promoted, who gets assigned to senior command positions, and whether those decisions reflect professional military criteria or political loyalty calculations, will shape the institutional culture of the military in ways that affect the civil-military relationship long after Trump's current term. And the broader public conversation about civil-military relations, shaped significantly by Milley's wannabe dictator statement and by the documented pattern of tensions across both Trump terms, will continue influencing how the American public understands the relationship between democratic governance and military institutions. The bottom line is this. Trump publicly accused his own chairman of the Joint Chiefs of treason, the most serious crime in the American legal code, and suggested the punishment should be death for making back-channel calls that Milley believed were necessary to prevent nuclear miscalculation. Milley responded publicly by saying U.S. troops swear an oath not to a wannabe dictator, but to the Constitution. The treason accusation reveals a claim about military loyalty to the president personally that is incompatible with the constitutional framework. The wannabe dictator response reveals how the nation's highest-ranking military officer assessed what he observed from the inside. And the broader pattern of civil-military tensions describes a military institution maintaining its constitutional orientation even under sustained pressure.